Before I invite Dr. Gallen to the stage, please enjoy this short video highlighting some of his achievements from Dr. Gallen's remarkable career.
That now there's a $2 million difference, again, with an issue where we had not a full cost of $750,000, now a $3.94 million, and now one company is $2 million more. I didn't wake up this morning to come down here and make anybody feel good. I came down here to do the people's work. So that everybody wins. So that everybody wins. So when we talk about taxpayers, some of these same individuals that we're talking about, they pay taxes too. They pay taxes too. Fret not thyself. There have been a lot of things that have been said, both in this place and outside. This board does not intimidate well. We have an obligation to protect those students and their rights to a quality education. But at the end of the day, it's the board's decision to render what's in the best interest of our school district as a whole. But when you juxtapose a financial penalty versus your obligation under the Constitution of the United States, and quite frankly, your obligation as a member of humanity and one that has concern, compassion, and commitment to children, that's a non-negotiable for us.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Steve Gallen III.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I want to ask a question. Who in this place at this time, is committed to unapologetically, strategically, and vocally rejecting any and all forms of mediocrity in the schools of your district, in your community, serving your students? Who in this place? Who in this place? Who in this place is committed to rejecting mediocrity in your schools, in your community, serving your students? Who in this place? Do I have anybody in this place? Again, good afternoon. To the Honorable President of NSBA, Dr. Viola M. Garcia, President-elect Frank Henderson, past President Charlie Wilson, Devin Del Palacio, Lydia Tadone, Stephen Chapman, we want to recognize and thank you for being here this afternoon. Let's give them a round of applause. I would like to introduce some amazingly committed, compassionate, and courageous educational leaders that represent you as members of the CUBE Steering Committee. My Vice Chair, Erica Mitchell. Secretary, Michelle McKissick. Immediate past Chair, Jacinto Ramos Jr. My good brother and champion for children, Makai Ali. Jamie Devine. Where you at, Brother Ray Freeman? Yolanda Fountain Henderson. Dr. Courtney Graves. Dr. Shavana Holman. Marquise Ivy. I see you, Brother Ty Jones. Miss Juanita Jordan. Dr. Joyce Morley. Brother Curtis Valentine. Real Men Teach. Yasmin Wagner. This year at CUBE's annual conference, you will hear from them during sessions and scheduled town hall meetings. You will hear from them. You will hear from them. And in her respectful place, we want to thank Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, not simply for her words, but her leadership and her representation as a father of 2 daughters of Black girl magic. I would like to extend my thoughts and prayers to the countless who have lost their lives to the devastation, destruction, and despair caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Please join me in a moment of silence for the lives lost, families impacted, and those who continue to fight for their futures and their lives. Thank you. The video captured in a little over 3 minutes the span of 4 years of what the power of your position as an elected school board member can educe for your employees, your community, your schools, and most importantly, your students. I am deeply humbled and honored that God chose and favored me, as He did each and every one of you, to be a conduit of leadership, a conduit of love, a conduit of support, inspiration, and service as elected and appointed school officials and educational stakeholders. You see, in November 2016, I was decisively elected. I emerged victorious with nearly 70% of the vote in a three-way race that included a 9-year school board incumbent who also previously served 8 years in the state legislature. He was on the ballot for a total of 17 years. And the other opponent was a former state legislator that also served 8 years in the Florida House. He is currently serving his second term in the Florida legislature. In this race, I was the youngest, unmarried, and the one with battle scars from nearly 30 years of educational service as a teacher, as a principal, as a district administrator, and as a superintendent of schools. You see, my friends, it does not suffice to get elected or appointed, to simply hold the title. To be imbued in titular leadership, what I've described as the intellectual ghetto of leadership. Titular leadership, in title alone. To simply declare that I am in the club. To simply say that I am on the team. To simply announce that I was in attendance at the game. If you are going to be a true change agent for what is right, what is rightful, and what is righteous for your schools, employees, community, and children, you have to get on the field of play. You have to understand that true educational reform is a contact sport, and one in which you have to be willing to hit or get hit, to tackle or get tackled, to get your jersey dirty. You see, I had been on the field of play for nearly 30 years, more than half of my life. And in doing so, yes, I had a few stains. I had a few rips. I got a few holes in my jersey. But if you live long enough, if you seek to do anything, if you are committed to disrupting enough, so will you. So will you. You will have a few ripped jerseys. You see, true educational change, reform, and I submit to you, revolution, involves a declaration of war. It involves battles that will truly result in a few bruises, a few black eyes, and even broken limbs. Our system of public education and our children and communities need leaders that are willing to get into the ring, get on the battlefield for educational and social justice, and to disrupt the silent cycle of apathy, often protected at all costs by the status quo. It is too often a status quo that accepts and fails to challenge the conditions that keep communities from prospering, educators from truly teaching, and most importantly, a status quo that keeps our children from learning. Our system of education needs deliberate disruptors. We need deliberate disruptors. Do I have any deliberate disruptors in this place today? We need you to be a disruptor for children. And to do so, you have to be willing, in the words of the late Congressman and civil rights giant, John Lewis, you have to be willing to get into some good trouble. Throughout my life, career, and educational campaign, I have always been a deliberate disruptor of those things that were not right for children and communities. You see, I campaigned and was elected on a platform of ensuring that Black, Hispanic, and poor students and communities had a strong, unapologetic voice toward educational equity and economic parity in a predominantly Black voting district in the nation's 4th largest school system. When I ran, I didn't promise to successfully pass over 50 board items, but I did. I didn't promise to feed students during school closures during Hurricane Irma and make it a board policy, but I did. Not to propose the first board item as the first step toward a $980 million local referendum to improve teacher salaries and school security. I didn't make that promise, but I did. Not to change board policy to enhance transparency and accountability for the $1.2 billion construction bond. In this year, for the most recent $1.1 billion that we are getting from the American Rescue Plan Act allocation. I didn't make that promise, but I did. What I simply promised my constituents that I would do, and that I would bring my nearly 30 years as an educator, as a teacher, as a principal, as a superintendent, and at the time, my 47 years of living, I simply promised 3 things: to stand, to speak, and if needed, to fight like hell for the children, employees, and people of the community. That I would be willing to leave the safe, secure sanctuary of the stands as a spectator and get on the field of play and risk getting my uniform dirty. You see, at the time, Miami-Dade County Public Schools was not only the nation's 4th largest school district, but had earned the distinction as one of the nation's most award-winningest school districts. From the Broad Prize given to the nation's top urban school district to the nation's top Magnet Award, our district was winning. Our district was winning. However, as my late father would always say, a rising tide lifts all boats. Not some boats, but all boats. On the ocean that may be. But in Miami-Dade County Public Schools, too many Black, poor, and Hispanic children in my district were catching academic hell and drowning in an ocean of underperformance. I had to disrupt that. African American businesses were not getting a fair share of an over $5 billion budget. We had to disrupt that. But academically in District 1, my district, we had the highest number of F and D schools in the county. I had to disrupt that. One school, Cal City Middle School, had a string of 5 consecutive F grades. I had to disrupt that. After declaring that school Exhibit A, ground zero, into some, even the hallowed ground for my entire campaign and election, through a clear sense of urgency and with the support of my colleagues on the school board, the first board item that I proffered in December of 2016 after getting elected the prior month was a board item to address failing schools. After the first year, Carroll City Middle School improved. It improved its grade from 5 Fs to a C and has been steadily climbing ever since. You see, we reformed the paradigm, the belief system, relative to the educability of its students. We reformed its practices through policy, not the day-to-day. Don't get caught up in that parenthetical obfuscation of the day-to-day. Don't get it twisted. The power is in policy. We reform pedagogy, practices around leadership, parental involvement, responsibility, and the ever-evasive spirit of accountability. Responsibility and accountability, those are two different constructs. And we reform partnerships. Just this past Monday, through the picture that you see, we started our day at Carroll City Middle School, celebrating it being a part of one of 16 schools throughout the county to receive a $2 million innovation grant to provide a safe, creative space in a newly designed media center with the latest technology this past Monday. But the previous system that we had to disrupt was an almost dual segregated system based on those schools and communities who basked in their academic success versus others who were left with the too often bitter taste of academic failure and defeat. A system that needed some disruption. It needed a departure from a sense of complicit silence. When you're silent, you're complicit. When you say nothing, you're complicit. When you do nothing, you're not only complicit, but you may even be a culprit. And despite these challenges, nobody said a word. Nobody said a word. People knew and watched. Yes, they applauded the district's overall success, but were conspicuously absent and silent when it came to the failure of certain students in certain zip codes. Too many were spectators sitting in deafening silence in the stands while our children and our schools failed. Not enough people were willing to get their uniform dirty. So if you are silent on these issues in your district, in your community, you are complicit. You are saying or doing little to nothing, even though you hold the key to unshackle large populations of students trapped in perpetual failure and generational poverty. You see, we must stand, speak, and fight against the academic and societal injustices that devastate schools, devalue communities, and most importantly, deny children. We must be willing to have the courage around the conversations and lift the veil around the role that race, politics, and economics, have in the devaluation of education in this country, which leads to the miseducation of too many of our students. You see, we are able to sit here this morning in the beautiful Marriott Marquis Hotel ballroom. We're able to sit because others stood, others spoke, others sacrificed, others fought, and others even died for our right to do so. This morning we comfortably sit because someone else disruptively stood. We're able to sit because someone else disruptively stood. You are able to sit because someone else before us disruptively stood. Whether it was Thurgood Marshall standing and speaking to the Supreme Court to argue Brown versus the Board of Education after declaring that separate was unequal, or Mr. Joseph Walpole standing up and speaking on my behalf, a brand new teacher from Boston, speaking up on my behalf as a wayward ninth grader, destined for prison, poverty, or an early death. Someone stood, spoke, and fought for us to be here. Each of us must honor those strong, vocal, and fighting spirits in our roles as educational leaders. You see, it's not about the letter grades. It's not simply about improving the letter grades in schools. But in Florida, this is our current draconian system of accountability, used to measure school and student performance, school letter grades from A to F. It is a throwback to a system that places a label, that places a stigma, not only on schools, but the students and the communities they serve. As a disruptor, we must say hell no. Hell no. As the nation grapples with the pandemic, and now recently the vicious Delta variant, once again, our schools, our public schools, our beloved system of public education are at the forefront of the national discourse about our country's reclamation and recognition of a sense of normalcy and economic prosperity. Many of us now have been confronted with a broader, more divisive, and highly political discourse about to mask or not to mask, the continued debate about in-person or virtual learning, and most importantly and likely, the devastating academic regression of Black, Hispanic, and poor children. But in the words of Thomas Paine, these are the times that try men's souls. As educational leaders in our respective districts, we remain ready, willing, able, and unapologetically and courageously committed to stand, speak, and fight for our children and community. Your unwavering, dedicated, and resolute service to your district, your community, and more importantly, your students are appreciated. As leaders, you must continue to, despite the cacophony of divisive politics, socio-political animus, and yes, systemic racism. Systemic racism. We don't have to be cowardly, unwilling to say it. Systemic racism. We must continuously provide a leveled, pragmatic, intelligent, scientific, and data-driven focus in hand to matters that have continuously endeavored to debunk science at the expense of the health, safety, and welfare of your employees and students. Your rejection of such notions makes each of you heroes in your districts. You see, you're not heroes because you're draped in a cape, that you wear a sleeveless garment, that you fly across the sky and are able to demonstrate incredible physical strength. Each of you is a hero, a leader of strength, because you are draped in commitment. You're draped in compassion. You're draped in courage. And you have chosen to not fly high above in the sky, but you have chosen to dive deep into the abyss of illiteracy, the abyss of poverty, the abyss of social injustice, and the abyss of systemic racism that continues to drown generations of Black and brown children. And those who, through no fault of their own, are born into poverty, they're born into crime, and zip codes of despair, devastation, devaluation, and destruction in urban centers throughout this nation. But you see, your love of children is your vaccination against the vitriol of apathy and low and no expectations. and the painful, pathetic, and persistently perpetuated paradigm and anti-equity ethos when it comes to the learning and lives of some children, Such conditions continue to create and exacerbate our most significant challenge. Such conditions continue to give life and rise and perpetual birth to public education's most formidable nemesis, the achievement gap. It didn't take the achievement gap for many of us to know that the intractable, stubborn achievement gap persists and that Black, Hispanic, and poor children in communities continue to lag behind whites on almost every single learning, life, and yes, even bank loan metric that matters. The achievement gap is one of the most widely discussed yet intractable issues in public education, which refers to the disparity in academic performance between different groups of students and shows up in your district, in my district. It shows up in student grades. It shows up in standardized test scores. It shows up in course selection offerings, what you offer to some students versus others. It shows up in dropout rates, and it shows up in college and career technical education participation and completion rates, among other measures of learning and academic success. It is the vexing, obstinate performance gaps between Black and Hispanic students as compared to their white, non-Hispanic peers. So I ask you a question. What does the achievement gap look like in your district? What are you doing to measure it? What are you doing from a policy perspective to monitor it? What are you doing to move it closer to closure? Over the past decade, educators, researchers, scholars, organizations, activists, and policymakers have focused on addressing the achievement gap. In doing so, many have expanded their focus and attention on other gaps, such as those based on gender, English language proficiency, immigration status, and learning disabilities. Despite such efforts, the challenge of narrowing the achievement gap in classrooms and schools remain a recalcitrant phenomenon in school districts throughout the nation. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused even greater concern for the adverse impact that distance learning and other innovative non-traditional approaches will have on students. If there have been concern and consternation around the achievement gap prior to the pandemic, such concerns and consternations have justifiably increased. You see, did I forget to tell you all that you look great today? That you look marvelous? I think I look a little spiffy, if I do say so myself. A little bit. But I, like many of you, didn't come to Atlanta, Georgia, this historical, sacred place that has been called the Mecca for the civil rights movement, to play political, partisan patty cake. We came here to honor the promise we made to the people who elected us and to the God we serve when we placed our right hand on the Bible and took an oath of office as school board members, signed a contract as a superintendent, professional educator, and took breath as a caring, compassionate, and committed member of humanity. I would like to remind you that although education is a predicate to this promise, your promise is not only to the provision of educational services to students. Your promise is also to supporting the paradigms, principles, and practices of social justice, of unity, of fairness, of equity, and equality. Consistently, each of you must be a strong, unified voice of advocacy on such issues of race and social justice, issues that have recently rocked the community, state, and nation with racial division, discord, disharmony, and distrust, and raise more questions about the fairness and integrity of the systems of government and criminal justice as they relate to Black, Hispanic, and communities of color and poverty. As educational and community leaders, we can ill afford to sit in the stands as spectators or remain on the sidelines, afraid to get on the field of play as people continue to feel and experience the sting of racism, the sting of marginalization, the sting of dehumanization, the sting of trauma and disenfranchisement. People who too often are Black, are Hispanic, and are poor. The brutal, public, and inexplicable death of George Floyd, a Black man whose life was taken by a white police officer, has resulted in the explosion of protests throughout the state, nation, and world. Mr. Floyd's slow, painful death occurred as the officer maintained his knee lodged into his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And as a crowd of onlookers watched and pleaded and recorded the callous denial of his citizenship, devaluing of his humanity, and eventual slow, painful, and horrific taking of his life. This issue reportedly arose from a call to police regarding the alleged use of a counterfeit $20 bill. Mr. Floyd's eventual death was over $20. Has your district taken a policy stand against social injustice? Has your district remained silent on issues that vex people who are Black, Hispanic, and poor? Has it taken a public position to affirm not only the importance of learning, but the value of the lives of the children you serve? Ensuring that all students know, that all students believe and realize that they have an equal and equitable opportunity for learning and lifelong success, regardless of race, is not only a guiding tenet of public education, but it is an obligation of each of you in this room responsible for its delivery and dispensation. In fact, it was the Brown decision that confronted blatant racism in its annihilation of the separate but equal rule, previously sanctioned by the Supreme Court in 1896, that permitted states and school districts to designate some schools whites only and others Negro only. More important, the Brown decision predicated on education. Remember, this decision was predicated on education, but it then focused the nation's attention. Started with education, but then it focused the nation's attention on the subjugation of Blacks and helped fuel a wave of freedom rides, sit-ins, voter registration efforts, and other actions leading ultimately to civil rights legislation in the late 1950s and 1960s. Education, my friends, should never be divorced from social justice. Education must always be wedded and married and linked and adjoined and aligned to social justice. It must always, it must always serve as the fulcrum of how students' education in and across this nation is to be provided and how within the structure of the school system and greater community are viewed and treated. as a district committed to diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion, the shouldering of ensuring the fair, equal, and just treatment of blacks and persons from undervoiced, underserved, and underrepresented communities represents an even heightened sense of social responsibility. It also provides an even greater opportunity to not only support students' achievement toward learning and life goals, but also helps in recognizing past and present inequities and in helping to rectify the economic and social inequalities and injustices of today. Such inequalities and injustices have too often resulted in poor students and those of color and with immigration status experiencing a lesser form of education, such as less qualified teachers, less course offerings, less culturally responsive teaching, and less programs of innovation and enrichment, and lower teacher expectations. Less and lower, less and lower, less and lower. Disrupt that. Disrupt that. Disrupt that. If in your district children who are black, Hispanic, or poor are receiving less and lower, disrupt that. These inequities, these injustices, and inequalities are often transitioned into experiences into the larger society, which often maintains inherent structural systems of racism, denial, and deprivation. These further impede students' pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, pursuits guaranteed by the United States Constitution. But despite the inequalities and injustices historically sown into the fabric of this country, my friends, we must remain committed to issues and practices of social justice, issues of fairness, unity, equity, and equality, and maintain the goal of eliminating disparities and educational barriers in your continued quest toward racial parity and diversity in schools across the district and throughout the community, state, and nation. Yes, today as I prepare to close, I want to remind you of that promise and that tremendous power that you, every single one of you, as policymakers, the power that you have as professional practitioners, the power that you have as individual people committed to the education, empowerment, and uplift of children and communities. You see, education is not simply about what takes place in a classroom with a group of students and teachers, or what takes place in a school with a principal, teachers, and students. What occurs with a superintendent in a district, among board members, employees, in a broader community. Education is a construct that must lean into the roots of what education means. It means to lead. Education means to bring forth, to draw out. As educational leaders and impact makers, we must nourish the emotional, spiritual, and intellectual well-being of our students and bring out everything in them to ensure that they reach their full potential for learning, their full potential for loving, their full potential for lifelong success. Now more than ever, our work must transcend the repair of a broken water fountain at a school. Your work must transcend that. It must go beyond dealing with simple complaints about the bus schedule. Our work, your work, must surpass the stylistic, symbolic, and ceremonial moments that are deduced to mere photo ops. And become intentional, strategic, and measurable movements, which takes you to deliberate and, on occasions, dirty debates and discourses around issues of educational equity that ultimately lead to decisions focused on the restoration and protection of high expectations and an unwavering belief in the educability of all children. This must be a movement that unleashes a fire hose, an endless well to quench their thirst for learning, their pursuit of their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. It must be a movement that transcends the simple buzzword of reform. This must be a movement. This must be a movement that embraces the need for educational revolution. Yes, we need a sudden, radical, and complete change of our system, starting with us immediately decimating the devaluing of our teachers, and disrespecting our system as a whole. But we also need to systematically revolutionize our system of public education through policy. You're board members. You revolutionize it through policy. We need us to advocate for education being a national priority, not simply in words, but in deeds and monetary investment. Because you see, education is a national security imperative. Our system and children need you to be revolutionaries. So, Dr. Gallen, what is the state of urban education? I say its current state is important, but not as important as its future. So, Dr. Gallen, what is that? Its future is based on what you do. Its future is based on what you determine. Its future is based on what you decide. Its future is based on what decisions you make or don't make. Because not to decide is to decide. What decisions you make in your district, whether or not you reject mediocrity in the schools that serve your children, in your community, whether or not you accept or reject mediocrity, and be ready, willing, and able to stand, to speak, and to fight like hell, to disrupt the status quo that allows and enables the failure of your children in your community, in your schools. For you are the leaders of public education. You are the ballers and shot callers for children and communities. You see, you are the playmakers for policies that change and improve and impact pedagogy, that improve practices, personnel, procedures, partnerships, that influence parents and paradigms for your school district. I say go forward in conviction. Go forward in compassion. Go forward in competence. Know your craft. Know your stuff. Go forward in courage and get on the field of play in this educational contact sport and get your jerseys dirty for children. So be a revolutionary for respect. Be a revolutionary for resources. Be a revolutionary for the restoration of education as a moral, professional, national, and spiritual imperative. May God bless you. May God keep you. May God protect you. May God strengthen you on your continued and collective fight for public education as the jettison for social justice. I say, Cube, let's work. Let's work. Let's work, Georgia. Let's work, Illinois. Let's work California. Let's work Florida. Let's work Texas. Let's work Arizona. Let's work Nebraska. Let's work Maryland. Let's work Kansas. Let's work Oklahoma. Let's work. Let's work. Let's work. Let's work. Let's work. Let's work. Let's work you. Let's work. Let's work for our children. Let's work for our children. Let's work. Let's work.